El foro escuchará ahora el examen nacional voluntario de Surinam, para lo cual invito al excelentísimo señor Albert Randim, ministro de Relaciones Exteriores, Negocios Internacionales y Cooperación Internacional de Surinam, a que realice su intervención. Ministro, tiene usted el uso de la palabra.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, my good friend, Ambassador Diego Pari. I'm pleased to present today Suriname's first voluntary national review on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. For that purpose, our report will be high level, as it's the first one. The government of Suriname is committed to the achievement and the implementation of the SDGs and underscores the importance of an inclusive development approach within the national policy frameworks, with the ultimate aim to leave no region and no one behind. I will present the main points of our VNR report and look forward to the interactive discussion later on. But allow me to introduce you a country full of life and unique living spaces and natural resources. Geographically, Suriname is situated on the northeast coast of South America and is divided into 10 administrative districts. Our population is highly diverse, rich in culture, arts, music, and cuisine. We are a peaceful community with high tolerance towards each other and acceptance of each other's cultures. Suriname's population is slightly more than 500,000, a small country, of which about 2/3 lives in the urban and rural areas and less than 10% in the interior. About 25% of the total population is younger than 15 years and about 12% is 60 years and older. Suriname has a tropical climate and is a high forest, low deforestation country with a total forested area of about 93%, of which 14% is protected by law. Suriname is one of the 3 countries in the world that is carbon negative and functions as a carbon sink and an oxygen provider to the world, and we are not compensated for that. The government considers the Sustainable Development Goals as an important parameter to measure sustainable growth and development. Therefore, the SDGs, all SDGs are integrated in the Multi-Annual Development Plan 2022-2026. That has happened for the first time. The priorities in this plan are the building blocks for a long-term 2050 vision. And allow me to add here that much more needs to be done. We are very much aware of that. We are fully satisfied at this moment, but our ambitions are far larger, both in terms of outreach as well as in terms of implementation. It should be noted that the private sector has taken up its responsibility and is working on raising awareness among its employees and further integrating the SDGs in corporate missions. As a first-time reporting country, the government of Suriname opted to report on the SDGs that are closely linked to its key priority areas, where sufficient disaggregated data is available. The objective of this approach was to work on matters that have a direct impact on the people and the environment. Therefore, the Republic of Suriname has identified SDGs 4, 8, 13, and 17 as the goals to be reported on. The Interinstitutional VNR Technical Committee, chaired by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, International Business and International Cooperation, guided and facilitated the preparations of Suriname's first VNR. Data collection and statistical analysis done by the General Bureau of Statistics, the line ministries, and the National Planning Office was the basis for reporting on the SDG indicators. Within the context of a whole-of-society approach, the VNR Committee facilitated several virtual stakeholder consultation sessions with representatives from the government, civil society, academia, private sector, UN agencies, and other relevant stakeholders. And as I mentioned earlier, more needs to be done. Additionally, one-on-one interviews were conducted with selected stakeholders to ensure data accuracy and refinement of information. To monitor the SDGs, the government established a structure through the National SDG Committee and the SDG public-private platform, including indigenous and tribal people, civil society, and the private sector and other stakeholders. I will now highlight, Mr. Chairman, some achievements and challenges with regards to the SDGs that our country has reported on. With regard to SDG 4, the government has invested in the access to education and it's making all efforts to leave no child behind. Some of the main policy measures were improving and expanding school infrastructure, facilitating school transportation, financial incentives and soft loans for vulnerable families, and school feeding programs. Subsequently, investments in redesigning of primary education curricula and restructuring the technical and vocational education were also prioritized. However, there remain challenges that we have to acknowledge. For example, our primary education completion rate is around 85%, but the rates are far lower at junior and secondary level. Disparities based on geographical area also remain a concern. The gender parity index is 1 at primary level and increases at secondary education level in favor of girls, thus meaning we have to address the issue of lower attendance of boys in secondary education. I also must mention here the impact of COVID-19 and the recent floods as a consequence of climate change that had a negative impact on accessibility and attendance. And as we continue our endeavors, the government will lay emphasis on, 1, a development-oriented curricula design, minimizing repeaters and children dropping out, facilitating access to education in the interior of Suriname, and expanding the education system with more schools and programs focusing on labor market demand. Before I elaborate on SG 8, Mr. Chairman, it is important to recall that in the past decade, Suriname went through some major economic shocks with a negative real growth of -5 in 2016, which increased to -16 in 2021, mostly because of COVID and high death ratios. Now in 22, we have recovered to a marginal 2% growth. We are also a highly indebted country with $4 billion debt, which is 160% of our GDP. So although Suriname has been ranked as a high mid-income country, there still are persistent disparities in urban, rural, and interior areas. To take urgent measures to combat the financial and economic crisis and the impact of COVID-19, the government is implementing the Recovery Plan 2020 until 2022 under an extended fund facility of the International Monetary Fund. So now on the SDG, it should be noted that some of the labor market policy interventions consisted of adopting legislation to protect the rights of employees, implementing a project to facilitate decent work or develop entrepreneurship for persons with disabilities, determining and implementing the minimum wages in 2018 and shortly in 2022, establishing the National Committee for the Elimination of Child Labor, and implementing a financial support program for employees, small and medium enterprises, and self-employed who lost income due to COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the progress made, there are points of concern such as unequal pay for equal work in the public and private sector if you compare to both. Women receive lower pay than men, which is mostly notable for those with a secondary or higher education level in certain sectors. The unemployment rate was around 9% in 2018, and youth unemployment remained between 17 to 22%. Our country also deals with a high informal sector. Going forward, Mr. Chairman, our government has prioritized diversification of the economy and continued labor market reform, facilitation of employment opportunities in the tourism, agriculture, and services sector, enhancement of technical and vocational skills training, support to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, especially in rural and interior areas, local content policy development related to the emerging oil and gas industry and beyond, and partnership with the private sector through PPPs. With regard to SD 13, we mentioned earlier that Suriname is vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. Because of the serious consequences of climate change, the government prioritized the development of the National Climate Change Policy Strategy and Action Plan for Suriname 2014-2021, the National Adaptation Plan 2019 to 2029, and the Nationally Determined Contributions 2020-2030. The government also finalized the RED Plus readiness phase, and the environment framework legislation was adopted. Although we have made progress in policy development, some urgent issues remain. We face challenges concerning the increased pressure on Suriname's forests due to economic activities such as logging and artisanal small-scale gold mining. Our limited institutional and human capacity and legislation that needs to be updated are impeding an optimal policy implementation. Another challenge we face is that of global financial arrangements and the implementation deficit. We notice that not more than 40% of climate financing is geared towards the Caribbean region. I state here today that in our view, region-wide, that there is no more need for studies and consultancies. The time for action is now when it comes to climate change and climate financing. In light of the aforementioned, in its way forward, the government will expand and strengthen institutional and human capacity, accelerate the adoption of legislation, convert the NDCs into concrete policy programming, adopt and implement the National Action Plan on artisanal and small-scale gold mining, maximize Suriname's position as an HFLD country, ensure full active participation and engagement of the ITPs, finalize the third national communication, and also design climate financing strategies and compensation mechanisms, a matter which was discussed with Secretary General Guterres recently in Suriname. On SDG 17, Suriname has built and intensified strategic partnerships at national, bilateral, and regional levels to stimulate development and make progress towards the SDGs. Technical assistance, small grants, and credit lines have been provided by development partners for various sectors, such as natural resources, energy, especially renewable energy, agriculture, environment, and health. To facilitate foreign direct investment and work on competitiveness of national companies, the government established the Suriname Investment, Trade, and Export Agency, CITA. Tax reforms and trade facilitation have been intensified in the past year and will be in the coming year. The government of Suriname will continue working on the recovery of the national economy. I would also like to emphasize that Suriname's classification as a high mid-income country, as mentioned before, impedes access to concessional financing. This classification does not reflect our reality, given that we are vulnerable in so many ways. So much more parameters should be analyzed to classify a country. Building strategic partnerships and alliances at both national and international level remain a priority. It is important for the government that Suriname's recent offshore oil and gas discoveries are fully maximized. That will happen in a responsible and environmentally friendly manner. Investments in science, technology, and innovation are therefore inevitable. The government of Suriname remains committed to achieving the SDGs and acknowledges a need for a stronger focus on advocacy and increased awareness regarding SDGs at community level while strengthening data collection, monitoring, and evaluation mechanisms. On the way forward, Mr. Chairman, the drafting of this report exposed the challenges and the gaps regarding the implementation of the goals. Therefore, the National SDG Committee and the SDG Public-Private Platform have a critical role in accelerating the implementation of the SDGs. I would also like to highlight the participation today of the Association of Indigenous Village Leaders in Suriname, FITS, in the Indigenous Navigator Program. As a result, a study on human rights issues in relation to the SDGs and other important development aspects for indigenous peoples as well has been conducted. Suriname's unique SDG Youth Ambassador Program will support raising awareness in society, especially among youth, for continued institutional and capacity strengthening as well as the optimization of data availability. I call upon the UN and all its partners to assist the government in this regard. transitioning to a green economy is a core commitment of this government, and we welcome technical support in that regard. Ultimately, mobilizing financing both nationally and internationally to achieve the SDGs is of paramount importance to us. I thank you very much. Grantangi, as we say in Suriname. Thank you.
Agradezco al ministro Ramdin por la presentación. Ahora ofrezco la palabra a las delegaciones. Invito a que puedan pulsar el botón del micrófono las delegaciones que quieran realizar sus consultas u observaciones. Recuerdo a las delegaciones que tenemos un tiempo de 2 minutos para realizar las intervenciones de los estados y otros participantes. Ahora ofrezco la palabra a la distinguida representación de Marruecos.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First of all, I would like to present our sincere congratulations to His Excellency the Minister of Suriname for his very comprehensive presentations of the VNR of Suriname. And we have a better picture about the situation, the economic situation in this country, but also the commitment and the engagement and the determination of the government and the high responsible of Suriname to go, despite all the challenges they are facing, to implement the SDGs and to take the country in the journey to 2030 with a lot of effort and with the creativity and also with inclusivity. On the basis of the frameworks and criteria formulated in your national voluntary review, Mr. Minister, you have highlighted 8 national priorities, among which there is energy access, including renewable energy and energy efficiency. You have also mentioned 3 or 4 times in your report the emerging oil and gas industry, which is an opportunity for growth for your country. In this vein, you are launching a call for foreign companies to support the exploration and production phase. How will you assure that your local development plan benefit from future oil and gas foreign investment? And what preference will be there for the CARICOM single market economy that Suriname is part of? And one more question, collaborating further on your expected growth based on the oil and gas industry, how will you protect the environment, as there are always risks for population involved with oil industry? How would this plan
Agradezco al distinguido representante de Marruecos. A continuación, doy la palabra a la representación de LGTBI Mayor Group.
Thank you, Vice President. We thank the government of Suriname for this report and its first ever engagement in the VNR process as part of the ongoing review of the implementation of the SDGs. Suriname civil society welcomes the SDG Commission and SDG Platform, 2 national mechanisms tasked with evaluating, monitoring, and reporting on the implementation of the SDGs. While the Commission consists only of representatives of government ministries, the last month established platform includes representatives of civil society, public and private sectors. Contributions by civil society to this VNR report were limited and not made via the SDG platform. The platform has only 1 civil society representative in addition to 1 indigenous and tribal peoples representative. There is no clarity on how the 2 mechanisms will effectively address the interests of specific population groups that are often discriminated against, such as women, young people, the elderly, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI+ people, migrants and refugees, and indigenous and tribal communities. The VNR report speaks of an alignment of Suriname's multi-annual development plan with the SDGs. However, the plan lacks concrete strategies with perspectives crucial to all populations vulnerable to systematic and ongoing human rights violations. It was also designed without sufficient civil society participation and lacks specific mechanisms to ensure that SDG-related efforts leave no one behind. Disaggregated, context-specific, and culturally sensitive data is needed to highlight results and make decisions on further actions. Therefore, how will the government of Suriname ensure a national inclusive process and strategy in further monitoring the implementation of the SDGs? In conclusion, despite of all concerns expressed, we civil society see an opportunity for effective engagement through the SDG platform. We remain committed to making the best use of the two national mechanisms to contribute to the successful implementations of all SDGs. Gran tangi, thank you.
Agradezco a la distinguida representación de LGBTI Group, Mayor Group. Ahora ofrezco la palabra a la representación de Singapur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to join others in congratulating Suriname on your very successful first VNR presentation. Suriname, like Singapore, is a small state, and we are both vulnerable to external economic shocks. Excellency, you highlighted in your presentation that Suriname experienced several economic recessions in the past decade, and that COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation. In this regard, could you elaborate on the social policies that your government has put in place to address the impact of these economic challenges? In particular, in terms of education policies, how does Suriname seek to address the inequalities in education between the different geographical regions? Thank you.
Agradezco a la distinguida representante de Surinam. Ahora ofrezco la palabra a la distinguida representación de Reino Unido.
Thank you. As one of the countries with the highest forest cover worldwide, Suriname's approach to forest conservation plays a vital role in supporting climate change mitigation, protecting biodiversity, and contributing towards multilateral agreements. Can the delegation outline how Suriname's national forest policy, particularly its three goals, economic, socio-cultural, and environmental, contribute towards SDG 15 and the government's nature-positive development plans? Thank you.
Agradezco a la distinguida representante de Reino Unido. No tenemos otras solicitudes de palabra. Voy a ofrecer nuevamente el uso de la palabra al distinguido representante de Marruecos. ¿No? No tenemos otras solicitudes de uso de la palabra. Agradezco a las distinguidas delegaciones que realizaron sus observaciones y consultas. Invito ahora al ministro de Relaciones Exteriores, Negocios Internacionales y Cooperación Internacional de Surinam a que responda brevemente a las preguntas de la sala durante un tiempo de 4 minutos.
Thank you very much for that challenge. First of all, I thank you all for the questions raised. I'll try to be brief. Let me indicate that in terms of local content policy, Ambassador of Morocco, our local content policy is being developed, utilizing the experience in other countries in Africa, but also in our own region, because we want to benefit of the knowledge which has been gained over time. This is local content policy not only for the oil and gas, but for the whole economy, including the agricultural and tourism sector. Those are the growth sectors as well. In terms of our CSME, single market and economy commitments, those remain. President Santokhi has indicated very clearly that local content for him is not within the national boundaries of Suriname, but it is within the whole Caribbean. So every Caribbean country can and will benefit from the newfound resources. And for that, they only need to register themselves as a company in Suriname and preferably partner with a Surinamese entrepreneur. In terms of your second question, how we will protect the environment, yes, there is always a risk to oil and gas. A couple of things we can mention there. First of all, we will put in place the necessary. We are in the process of putting in place the required legislation based on international standards. We will hold the companies also accountable in terms of international standards, and we work with some global NGOs on that. We are building capacity domestically to be able to prevent these things from happening, but also if something would happen, to be ready for response. And we have discussed within the region and working with Guyana, next door Guyana, which has also resources, and with Trinidad and Tobago to work together in terms of responding to eventual hazards that may occur. In terms of our friends from Suriname, just wanted to mention, thank you very much. I take the questions as we receive them. The platform which has been established is a platform with a core group, but under that platform, all organizations in the country can be part of that. So that process just started, but I can assure you that all NGOs in Suriname are able and welcome to participate in this process. We will make no exception, and the platform with its membership is just a small group to be able to coordinate better. I also want to indicate that this government, when we took office in 2020, we made a point to include the whole society in the formulation of our plans. So the National Development Plan, but also the policies from the government, since even before we took office, we had hearings with more than 100 NGOs, 100 other organizations, functional groups in society. So we are very much aware that all need to be involved in the problems which we are. And you know the statements of President Santokhi, all Surinamese, wherever they are part of the solution to get to an economy which is again sound and upon which we can build a new future. With regard to the question from our colleagues from Singapore, yes, COVID-19 created a very difficult situation in many ways for countries, but certainly for certain parts of our societies. What we have done as a country in terms of the social programs is we increased the support to families with low incomes, elderly, children and persons with disability, and that was all to increase their purchasing power. But beyond that, we have also supported them in terms of medical facilities and other social support. Regretfully, for instance, we had some Surinamese die from the COVID-19. Again, there was support provided to the families who could not afford the expenses that go along with that, just to give you some idea of that. But also more structurally, in terms of improving the purchasing power, is in terms of subsidies, dedicated subject subsidies in terms of energy, fuel, and others. In terms of the questions from the United Kingdom with regard to how we approach the forest conservation, I must say, I'm indicated we are 93% forested. We want to keep it like that. We want to remain also carbon negative together with Bhutan and with Panama. It's not an easy task, but I believe that the commitment from the government is there. We have a sustainable forest management program as an essential part of our national development strategy. The National Red Cross strategy is in place. We have very ambitious NDCs submitted to the UN FCC. We are committed to executing those. We are working on mangrove replantation to avoid flooding in the coastal area. A couple of challenges which we have to address through legislation are, for instance, the damage done by artisanal and small-scale mining, the use of mercury as well in terms of the rivers. I can go on, but our commitment is there to remain carbon negative, to remain highly forested with a low deforestation, but it requires also for us to think about how we can get into a discussion on how we support countries which are highly forested and operate as a carbon sink for other countries to be able to continue their economic development. And that's a balancing trick, but this is going to be high on the agenda for Suriname, for CARICOM, when we meet in Egypt later this year. Thank you very much.
Agradezco al ministro de Relaciones Exteriores, Albert Randim, por sus respuestas y saludamos los importantes avances logrados por su país. Hemos concluido la presentación de Surinam. Haremos ahora